Picture this: the cold walls of a hospital, the sound of monitors, and the light of the operating room shining in your eyes. A woman is lying on the table, her life hanging by a thread. She has lost consciousness, not knowing that she is on the verge of death. But then a doctor approaches her, a professional with a lot of experience. However, there is one detail that will make everything even more tense. This doctor is a black man, and the woman whose life he saves has hated people like him her whole life. When she opens her eyes, her reaction will shock you. Would you expect gratitude for saving your life? No. Instead, her face will be distorted with anger and fury. But why? How can you hate the person who just pulled you back from the brink of death? Friends, before we continue, write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. We always want to know more about you. You are incredibly important to us and our channel. Your comments and likes help us spread stories like this around the world so that more people think about the most important questions of humanity and empathy. And really, don't forget, each of you is part of this big mission. Every comment and like helps us grow and spread positive changes. We appreciate you endlessly. Enjoy watching. The night rain pounded the hospital windows, as if trying to penetrate the cold and sterile walls. The operating room was tensely silent, broken only by the sounds of medical equipment and the muffled voices of doctors. Dr. Erickson, an experienced surgeon, stood silently over the patient, concentrating on the monitors. His hands moved with the precision of a watchmaker. Every action was carefully measured, every step thought out to the smallest detail. His reputation was impeccable, and today everything depended only on him. The patient lying on the operating table before him presented a special problem. Her name was Linda Johnson, a middle-aged woman who had long been known for her ardent adherence to extreme racist views. Her uncompromising hatred of people of other races was well known in the small town. She made no secret of her beliefs and loudly declared more than once that she would not tolerate the presence of outsiders near her. However, the irony of the situation was that this outsider was now fighting for her life. Linda was taken to hospital with serious complications. Emergency surgery was her only chance to survive. Her heart was barely beating, and her vital signs were rapidly deteriorating. And by the time she was taken to intensive care, it was already on the verge of death. Dr. Erickson didn't hesitate for a second before performing the operation. He knew who this woman was, knew that she despised people like him, but he also knew that his Hippocratic oath and his duty as a doctor required him to act without bias. Life was life, no matter who it belonged to. But even knowing this, deep down Erickson felt a lingering unease. He couldn't help but wonder, how would this woman react if she knew who had saved her? The operation went on for hours. Sweat beaded on Erickson's forehead as he steadily and methodically repaired Linda's damaged organs. The air in the operating room was tense and expectant, with each assistant holding his breath. At one point, it seemed as if the chances were lost. Her heart stopped and everything fell into an eerie silence. The assistants looked at each other, waiting for the order. But Erickson didn't give up. He immediately ordered the defibrillator to start, and the shock ran through Linda's body, causing her heart to beat again. The moment seemed like an eternity. And then, finally, the indicators began to improve. Life was returning to her body like drops of water reviving the parched earth. The operation had been a success, and now all that was left was to wait for her to wake up. Time passed and Linda slowly came to her senses. Her eyes slowly opened, and in the semi-darkness of the room she saw outlines of people. For the first few seconds she was disoriented, not understanding where she was. Fragments of memories floated in her head, how she lost consciousness, the feeling of weakness and coldness enveloping her body. But then her gaze focused, and there stood a man, a black man in a white coat, Dr. Erickson. She instantly tensed. Anger and hatred boiled in her chest like molten lava. Her face twisted in rage. Even in her weakness from the surgery, this was the very type of man she despised with all her soul. And now he was standing in front of her, perhaps even touching her. What are you doing here?" she croaked, barely able to move her tongue. Her voice was weak, but it was filled with years of accumulated hatred. Dr. Erickson watched silently, not as if he were tired from a long operation, but as if something deeper, a mixture of disappointment and understanding. He had expected this reaction, though he had not been fully prepared for how sharp it would be. "You're in the hospital, Mrs. Johnson," he replied calmly, trying to keep his voice even and professional. "You've had a complicated operation, but everything went well. Now you need to rest. The operation? Linda struggled to comprehend his words, her gaze darting around the room as her brain began to connect the fragments of memories. She slowly raised her hand to her chest, where she still felt the dull ache of the recent intervention, but her mind was fixated on something else. You, her voice trembled as she looked into Erickson's face. You operated on me? There was no surprise in her voice, only pure hatred. Dr. Erickson continued to look at her with the same calm, trying to keep his composure. He knew that her hatred for him now was inextricably linked to who she had been all her life, but deep down he hoped that the reality of the situation would at least make her think. Yes, I performed your operation. You were on the edge, but now you are safe, he answered, showing no emotion. Linda tensed, her breathing became ragged. She clutched the sheets in her fists, as if trying to gain control of her own body, which was consumed by rage. Her face was flushed, her eyes were flashing, and despite the pain and weakness, she sat up a little higher on the bed, trying to get a better look at the doctor. You shouldn't have touched me, she croaked, her voice shaking with anger. You have no right. I'd rather die than let your filthy hands touch me. The words struck the doctor like a dagger, but Erickson remained unperturbed. Deep down inside, he felt that no amount of effort, no amount of action could change what she felt for him, the man who had just saved her life. Your health and life are my job, Mrs. Johnson, he said slowly, choosing his words so as not to fuel her hatred even more. I did what I had to do as a doctor, no matter who you are. Her breathing became ragged, her eyes darted from side to side, but the doctor did not back down. Silence fell over the room, and even the walls seemed to sense the tension emanating from the sick woman. Linda Johnson, who had just returned from the brink of death, instead of fearing death, felt fear that she had been saved by someone she had despised her entire life. I didn't ask you, she hissed through her teeth, trying to keep her head up despite her weakness. I would never let your kind save me. It's against everything I believe in. Dr. Erickson, though accustomed to expressions of hatred, felt something boiling inside him. He was a doctor who had dedicated his life to saving people, and he had seen many suffer. He knew how pain and fear could transform a person, but he had never encountered such a toxic level of hatred. He realized that before him was a woman who had lived her entire life surrounded by hatred, and her prejudice was deeply ingrained in her mind. You had two choices, Mrs. Johnson, he said quietly but firmly. One was to die on the operating table, the other was to live, and I did everything I could to make sure you chose life. Linda froze, her eyes widened as if she had suddenly realized something important, but her mind, accustomed to hatred, did not allow this realization to break through. She still could not accept the fact that she had been saved by someone she considered the enemy. You don't understand. Her voice shook, but this time not only from anger, but also from something akin to fear. You don't understand what it means for me to live knowing that someone like you saved my life. It's impossible. Dr. Erickson sighed, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of those words. He couldn't change her mind, he couldn't make her see him as a person instead of something to hate, but he knew one thing, the life he had saved would never be the same again. Dr. Erickson exhaled slowly, feeling the tension coursing through every cell of his body. He stood before the woman for whom his existence was her worst nightmare, her world built on the fear of people whose skin was different from hers. She lay before him, alive only because of his skill and control, and instead of relief, fear and hatred flooded her consciousness. Linda tried to lift her hand, but her body was too weak from the surgery. She looked at him again, full of disgust, but now there was something else in her eyes, panic. For her, reality was collapsing like a house of cards. She was not just surviving thanks to a man she hated. She owed her life to someone she considered an enemy. I can't believe this, she croaked, her tongue struggling to move. Her heart was racing, as if her mind was trying to deny what had happened. This is a mistake, you shouldn't have, damn you. Each word was like a lash, her voice breaking, becoming higher and higher pitched and hysterical. Erickson tensed involuntarily. He knew he was dealing with something much bigger than mere racism. This was a deep, painful obsession with hatred. She had cultivated this fear for so long that now that reality had hit her with the truth, her mind simply couldn't accept it. Mrs. Johnson, Erickson tried to calm her down, despite the fact that he was internally shaken by her rage. You need to calm down. Your body needs rest now. Stress will only make your condition worse." But these words only ignited a new round of rage in her. Linda turned her head with difficulty, her eyes burning with fire. "Don't tell me to calm down," she screamed. Her face was twisted with anger and despair. Her voice was breaking, and her hands were shaking on the sheets. "You don't understand. You don't know what this means to me. How can I live knowing that a man like you touched me? Your filthy hands. How can I look at myself in the mirror now?" Erickson stood silently, trying to control himself. Conflicting emotions were seething inside him: pity for this woman, horror that hatred could reach such a level, and a dull disappointment that even in the face of death she could not see the man behind his skin color. "I'm a doctor, Mrs. Johnson," he replied, still calm, though he could feel the tension building inside. "My job is to save lives, no matter who's in front of me. I don't pick and choose who I help. But I would choose." Her voice sounded like a cry of despair, filled with pain and bitterness. "I would choose to die. It would be better if you let me die." The words were like a blow to the heart. They hung in the air like a muffled groan from the deepest nightmare. Linda, who still held on to her hatred, was ready to sacrifice her own life rather than be saved by a man she considered impure. It was beyond her comprehension that the Black Doctor, the man she despised with all her soul, was not only her savior, but also the only one who could bring her back to life. She began to gasp, her chest heaving as if the air was poisoned to her because her life now belonged to the man she had always hated. Erickson moved closer to make sure she was not experiencing any physical complications from the surgery, but Linda flinched as if he was going to hurt her. "Don't come near me," she screamed, her eyes becoming like those of a wild animal cornered. "Don't you dare come near me. I don't want you near me." Her words echoed in his ears, but Erickson couldn't back down. He was a doctor, and he knew that his job now was to monitor her condition, even if she didn't want it. The inner duty was stronger than her screams. "You have to understand," he said slowly, trying to keep his voice steady, "that your health is a priority right now. You may not love me, but I won't let you die because of it. I'm here to help you." But Linda couldn't hear his words. There was only one thought in her head now: how could she allow her life to depend on a black man? Her entire ideology, her worldview, collapsed the moment she realized that she now owed him her life. It was a nightmare from which she could not wake up. You ruined everything," she moaned, her voice growing quieter but no less angry. "You ruined my life. I can't live with this anymore. I wish I was dead. I wish." Erickson listened to her in silence. There was more understanding than condemnation in his eyes, though inside he felt the pain of her words piercing him. He knew the world wouldn't change overnight. He knew people like Linda Johnson would always exist, and he knew their hatred was deeper and more dangerous than mere prejudice. It was rooted in a fear that lurked deep within, a fear of change, a fear that the world they had built on hate would one day collapse. But Erickson didn't back down. He couldn't let her die even if that's what she wanted. Linda Johnson lay in her hospital bed, her face pale and twisted with hatred. Her eyes were like hellfire, a mixture of rage and despair, as if her world had been torn apart. She couldn't believe what had happened. A black doctor, a man she had spent her life despising, had just saved her life, and the thought was unbearable. Every glance at him sent a wave of disgust through her. For her, Dr. Erickson was more than just a doctor. He was the embodiment of everything she hated and rejected. His calm, his professionalism, his even voice seemed to only add fuel to the fire. She tried to turn away, to close her eyes, but somewhere in the depths of her consciousness, the voice kept repeating over and over again, "You're only alive because of him. You don't understand." Her voice sounded hoarse, intermittent, as if each phrase cut her from the inside. "I can't. I don't want to live with this. You destroyed everything." Erickson was silent, feeling the cold wall of racial hatred she had built up over the years separating them. He knew that her words had nothing to do with gratitude or even simple understanding. This was not a situation in which one could find redemption or forgiveness. This was a nightmare for her, where life and hatred were intertwined in one vicious circle. "Mrs. Johnson," he tried to speak again, without showing his fatigue and pain. "I'm here to help you. Nothing more. Your feelings for me won't change the fact that I saved your life." But these words only increased her anger. Everything in her mind was turning upside down. She saw before her not a man who had given his energy and strength to save her, but a threat to everything she believed in. "You shouldn't have saved me," she screamed, her voice breaking through the pain like the growl of a wounded animal. "You shouldn't have. People like you can't touch people like me. We We should stay in different worlds." The words were spoken with a feral rage, as if she were burning bridges even in the face of death. Linda, whose life had been steeped in hatred of blacks, could not accept that her existence was now tied to someone she considered below her. It was her own personal hell, knowing that she had to survive thanks to those she had spent her life despising. She looked at his face and saw not a doctor, not a man who had dedicated years to studying and helping people. She saw only his skin, that same black skin that was for her a symbol of everything base, everything dangerous, everything alien. "You and those like you." Her voice was quieter, almost a hiss, but every sound was laced with hatred. "You will never be equal. Do you think your job makes you important? Do you think it will change who you are?" Dr. Erickson stood listening to this torrent of poisonous words. There was sympathy in his eyes, but also a dull weariness. He had seen such looks before, on the streets, in crowds, from people who were filled with hatred simply because of the color of his skin. But here, in the operating room, where he was the one who gave people a second life, the poison seemed especially bitter. "I did my job," he said quietly, trying not to show how her words affected him. "And I'll do it again if I have to. My job is to save lives, no matter who's in front of me." Linda gritted her teeth, her hands shaking again on the sheets. She couldn't stand it. Her body, her mind, everything rebelled against the idea that she owed her life to the man she had always considered an enemy. "I'd rather die." Her voice cut through the silence of the room. "I'd rather die than let the black one save me." The words that spilled out of her were the last drop of her inner terror. It wasn't just anger, it was fear of a world that was crumbling before her eyes. Her entire life had been built on racial barriers, on the idea that her white skin made her taller, cleaner, better. And now this man she considered dirty had become her savior. She hated herself for being weak. She hated this world where black could have power over her life, and she couldn't accept it. Her heart, full of racist hatred, beat faster and faster, and with each beat her thoughts became darker. Erickson stood before her, looking at this woman, and thought about how many more like her were still living, breathing, hating. He knew he couldn't change her, but he wouldn't let her hate break him. He was doing what he had to do, saving a life, even if that life was tainted with the poison of hate. Linda Johnson clutched the sheets again, her breathing growing heavy, her face flushed with rage, and she forced the words out again. "You will never be like us, never." The words, spoken with such contempt, hung over him like a heavy cloud. But Dr. Erickson knew the truth. The truth was that his actions spoke louder than her hatred. He had saved her, and though she could not accept it, that truth would remain with her forever, an indelible stain on her consciousness. Linda Johnson lay in her hospital bed, clutching the sheets so tightly her knuckles were white. Hatred seethed in her mind, poisoning every thought, every sensation. Her entire being was aflame with contempt and rage. She could not accept that her life depended on a man she considered lesser, unworthy of even being in the same room with her. Dr. Erickson stood there, his face calm and professional, though inside he felt every word she said, laced with racist venom, hit him. He knew this woman couldn't accept the fact that he, a black man, had been her savior, but his duty, his oath as a doctor, always came before her hatred. "You think you can save me?" Her voice was so contemptuous that the air in the room seemed to thicken with her hatred. "You, black? You should have let me die. How could you take such impudence upon yourself? You have no right." Her eyes were blazing with fury, as if she was about to break down and attack him, despite her weakness. For her, this situation was the embodiment of her deepest nightmare. A black man was not just next to her. He controlled her life. He was in charge of her destiny. For Linda, this was unbearable. "I wasn't going to ask your permission to save your life," Erickson replied calmly, but there was a faint note of weariness in his voice. He knew it was useless to try to explain anything to her, but he couldn't just stand there. "I'm a doctor, and it's my job to do everything I can to keep my patients alive, even if they don't want to." "You're not a doctor." Her voice rose, almost to a scream. "You're just nothing." She practically spat the word out. "You think white patients want you to touch them? You're wrong. You don't deserve this job. You shouldn't have saved me. Your black skin defiled me the moment you came near." Erickson took a deep breath, trying to contain the emotions her words were evoking in him. He had grown accustomed to racist views and words over the years, but here, within the walls of a hospital, in this sterile room where everything was supposed to revolve around saving lives, the hatred seemed especially absurd and cruel. He knew he couldn't change her worldview, but her words cut him like knives. Mrs. Johnson, he began, trying to keep his voice even. Your life was in danger. I did what I had to do as a doctor. I saved you, and unfortunately for you, your skin color doesn't make you better or worse than other patients. I treat everyone the same. But these words only fueled her fury. Linda could not accept that this man dared to speak to her as an equal, as if his actions could erase the difference between them. For her, every moment, every breath was filled with the thought that her life was now tied to someone she despised. You can't compare yourself to me, she screamed, and there was real hysteria in her voice. I'm white. I'm better than you by definition. You should have been the one kneeling before me, not standing here as if you had the right to be my savior. The words, laced with hatred and contempt, struck Erickson, but he stood before her. There was no anger in his eyes, only a cold, deep understanding that her fear of him was greater than her fear of death. She was afraid of losing her illusion of superiority. You can hate me as much as you want, he said quietly, looking straight into her eyes. That's your right, but it won't change the fact that I saved your life, and it won't change the fact that you're alive now because of me. The words seemed to pierce her. Linda jerked as if to get out of bed, her face contorted in a grimace of disgust and pain. She couldn't bear it, the thought that her existence was now tied to the life of a black man. Her hatred, her prejudices, her beliefs, all of it crumbled under the weight of reality. I'd rather die than live with this, she cried again, her voice full of despair. I'd rather die than be beholden to a scumbag like you. You and your kind, you're all the same. You want to take over our world, take our lives, our jobs, and now you think you can be proud of saving me? You'll never be like us. Dr. Erickson looked at her, knowing that old, deep-seated fears were swirling around in her head. It was a fear of change, a fear that her world no longer belonged only to people like her. There was something primal, something terrifying in her gaze, a fear that her hatred was wrong. That fear had transformed into a violent aggression. I'm not trying to be like you, Mrs. Johnson, he replied calmly. I'm just the man who saved your life. What you do with that life is your choice. Her eyes flashed with hatred. She tensed again, clenching her teeth. Her breathing quickened like a cornered animal. Linda tried to rise again, but her body did not obey. It seemed that her soul was torn apart by the fact that her savior was the man she had always considered her enemy. You ruined my life, she moaned, her voice almost on the verge of tears. You shouldn't have done this. Now it's all over. I'll never be able to go back to normal. You did this. These words, filled with despair and hatred, were the last cry of her soul. Consumed by hatred, she could not accept that her life was now connected to the man she had rejected all her life. Her world collapsed, and the only thing that remained was hatred, eating away at her from within like poison. Dr. Erickson stood before her, knowing that her words were more than just attacks. They were the cry of a soul that had lost its illusory security. Linda Johnson lay in her hospital bed, sweating profusely, her eyes darting around the room, searching for anything that would give her some measure of control. Every time she glanced at Dr. Erickson, her face twisted in hatred, as if this wasn't a savior, but the embodiment of her darkest nightmares. Erickson stood still, despite the tension within him, still aware of the weight of his duties, but in his heart he felt the incessant stream of racial insults beginning to pierce his peace. He had seen people like this before, had faced hatred, but here, in the face of death, where everything had to come down to life and death, the absurdity of her hatred seemed especially hard.
Linda tried to sit up, lifting her head from the pillow with difficulty, but her strength was leaving her. Even in this moment of weakness and vulnerability, she could not stop her hatred. How many like you work here? She hissed with hatred. What chance do I have? There are people like you everywhere in this hospital. They all think they can save white people's lives. It's a disgrace to the country, to society. You are all filth, parasites who want to get into other people's lives. She spoke breathlessly, but her anger, her racist belief, were stronger than her physical pain. Her voice was filled with horror at a world she could no longer control, at people she felt had no right to succeed, to exist with her. You think your job makes you a better person? She continued, her voice shaking with rage. You're only here because our government gives you the opportunity. You don't deserve to be in this hospital. Treating people like me. You stole my life. You're a disgrace to this profession. You don't even realize that your hands. She looked at his hands with disdain. Those hands shouldn't touch my skin. Erickson looked down at his hands, singing briefly but not interrupting her. He knew her hatred wasn't directed at him personally. It was fear of losing power, of a world in which her racist ideals were crumbling. She represented what he and his colleagues faced every day: old prejudices, a refusal to acknowledge change. I should have just walked away, Linda whispered, her voice growing weaker. Just left me to die. How could you even allow yourself to decide that I deserve to life? She began to breathe raggedly again, her chest rising and falling heavily. Who are you to decide whether I live or die? There was that terrible combination of fear and contempt in her voice again. She couldn't accept that her savior was a man she considered beneath her, a man she would never have allowed anywhere near her in any other situation. Now her body existed only because of the man she had despised all her life. You want to humiliate me, don't you? Linda clenched her fist on the sheets, her eyes filled with tears. But these were not tears of pain, but of rage and humiliation. You want me to admit that I owe you? Never, never will I say that you did something good for me. You are just a scumbag who took advantage of the moment to prove that you, blacks, can mean something in this world, but you will always remain a known entity. Erickson listened carefully as her words grew more desperate. He knew she was on the verge of a complete emotional breakdown, but that didn't lessen the weight of the insult she was throwing at him. The doctor was used to dealing with criticism, with disgruntled patients, but this was something different. This was pure, unbridled hatred, unleashed in the face of someone she couldn't accept as either a person or a savior. I saved you because it's my job, he said again quietly, his voice even but heavy underneath. I would have saved any other patient in your place. Your belief or your hatred do not influence my actions. Linda groaned in frustration, muttering curses against him over and over. There was no greater humiliation to her than the realization that she had survived thanks to those she had despised all her life. Her entire worldview had been shattered beyond a fact: a black man had saved her. You think you've defeated me? She hissed, her face twisted in anger. You think I'll be grateful? That I'll change my mind about people like you? No, you'll always be nothing to me, and I'll make sure everyone knows that people like you work in this hospital. You'll never be equal, you'll always be beneath me, even if you think otherwise. Her voice shook, her face flushed with effort, but every breath she took was filled with hatred that clouded her judgment. For her, this was more than just a medical intervention. It was an attack on her world, on her value system, which had collapsed under the weight of an act. She could not forgive Erickson for giving her life a life she could no longer live with her old belief. You don't dare to be my savior, she whispered, her gaze becoming more and more empty, and Erickson understood that she would not be able to find a way out of this internal hell. He stood silently, knowing that no words or explanations would help her come to terms with reality. She remained a prisoner of her hatred and prejudice. Linda tried to sit up again, but her body was weak. She was shaking with helplessness and hatred. Her eyes, filled with tears of rage, did not leave Dr. Erickson, as if she wanted to burn him with her gaze. She could not accept the fact that her life was saved by a black man. For her, this was the most terrible humiliation. I would never let you touch me if I could help it, she croaked, gritting her teeth. You're just disgusting. Do you think your job makes you better? You're just black, and you'll always be beneath me. Her words grew louder, hysterical. Linda thrashed about on the bed like a cornered animal, unable to control her rage. There was only one way for her to express her hatred: through insult. and she clung to them like a last straw. You are a mistake of nature. How dare you think you can be a doctor? She continued, her voice shaking with rage. White people will always be above you. They created this world, they rule it, and you can never be a part of it. Don't you dare think that you are on par with us. You are nothing but a fraud hiding behind your white coat. Erickson felt a cold wave of weariness and anger building in his chest. He could see that her hatred wasn't just a flash of the imagination, it was her worldview. Her conviction that she was white and therefore automatically better and more important. She couldn't accept that she was now completely dependent on someone she considered beneath her.
You and all those like you, Linda continued, not stopping for a second, her words sounding more and more aggressive, want to destroy our world. You come, lay claim to what we have created, and you think that anyone will respect you? Never. You don't even realize how funny you look in that robe, as if you could be a real doctor. Her laugh was vicious and harsh, like a whip crack. Erickson stood before her, his face unreadable, though inside he felt her words tearing at his patience. He wanted to say something back, but he knew it was useless. Her hatred was too deep. You will never be like us, Linda screamed, not letting him get a word in. How could you even dare touch me? You defiled my body with your filthy hands. I would rather die than let you touch me. You are not worthy of even standing next to me. Her voice became shrill, almost shrill. She was thrashing about in rage. Her face was red. Her eyes were filled with tears. Every scream she made was laced with hatred for Erickson, for his skin color, for the fact that he was in a situation where she couldn't control him. It was like a terrible nightmare, where her life depended on someone she despised with all her soul. You are nothing but filth, she hissed again, her voice shaking with hatred. You and all your kind, you are a curse to this world. You will always be beneath us whites. This is our world, and you are superfluous in it. You are not worthy of being a doctor. You are not even worthy of breathing the same air as me. Erickson listened to these words, and each time they cut him like a knife. He understood that before him was a person completely captured by her prejudices and fears. Her racism was her last bastion, behind which she hid from a world that had long since changed. But now these words were especially cruel, because they were born from her fear and humiliation. I'm not going to apologize for saving your life, Erickson finally said coldly, his voice as hard as steel. I'm a doctor, and my job is to save people, no matter what their beliefs are. But if you want to continue to hate me for doing my job, that's your problem. The words seemed to explode her even more. Linda tried to sit up again, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. How dare you speak to me in that tone? She screamed, her voice rising to a shriek. You should have been kneeling before me and begging for forgiveness for daring to touch me. You have no right to speak to me as an equal. You will never be my equal. You are nothing but a black man, a damned black man who should know his place. Erickson took a deep breath, holding back the emotions that were beginning to bubble up inside him. He knew she was trying to humiliate him, trying to regain some measure of power in this situation, but her words only showed her own weakness. You belong in a ghetto somewhere, Linda continued, not slowing down the pace of her insults. You shouldn't have even gotten into medical school. I'm sure you were only helped because of your skin color. You're not a real doctor. You're a failure of the system. You're incapable of saving normal people. You just used your race to get here. Her words hit Erickson again, and he felt anger rising in him, but he knew he couldn't give in to her provocations. Linda continued to pierce the silence with her hatred, her voice becoming more and more like a scream. Every rebuke, every insult burned like fiery arrows. Erickson, holding back his anger, realized that there was more to her words than just racism. It was a deep, abiding hatred born of fear. You think the color of your skin gives you the right to save me? She screamed again, trying to make herself look strong. Don't you understand what you're doing? You're incapable of compassion. You're just a machine, and you'll never understand what it means to be human. Her words continued to sound like a death sentence, and there was something more tragic in them than just a racial slur. It was the cry of a person who realized that his world had been destroyed. Linda hated Erickson not only for the color of his skin, but also for the fact that he had become her last hope in a situation where she could not control her life. I don't want you to save me, she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of rage, not repentance. I'd rather die than be saved by someone like you. Erickson closed his eyes, trying to cope with the emotional storm inside. He knew that in her heart there was not only hatred, but also terror that her life was being controlled by someone she could not accept. Every cry she made reminded him of how she had imagined her life, and how abruptly everything had changed. "You just confirm all the stereotypes I've always thought about people like you," she continued, clenching her fists on the sheets again. "You'll never be able to get rid of who you are. You'll never be able to become a normal person. You'll never be like me." Erickson couldn't hold back any longer. He took a step closer to her, though his heart was beating faster with each step. He knew he had to let her hatred go unanswered, but it was harder than he thought. "Do you really think your life is more important than mine?" he asked, his voice calm but the storm building inside him. "Don't you understand that I risk every second of my life to save people, no matter their race or color? I dedicated myself to this work because I believe in the value of every life, but you can't understand that when your mind is clouded with hatred." Linda laughed, but it was a laugh full of pain. "You don't understand," she cried. "You're just playing a role. You'll do all this for others, to get praise, but in reality, you'll never see us as equals. You hate the very idea of whiteness. You'd rather everyone around you were like you." Her voice filled the room, and Erickson felt his own humanity begin to slip away from him. She was the person he had saved, and now he realized that her hatred was as strong as her fear. She wasn't just afraid of him, she hated him because he was the one who could take control of her life away from her. "I don't want you to save me," she screamed again, her face flushed with emotion. "I'd rather die than live knowing my life depends on someone like you. You don't even know what it's like to be human, to have real value." Erickson stood there, his heart breaking. He knew he couldn't change her, couldn't make her see him as a person other than the black doctor who had saved her life. She was locked in her hatred, and even when her life depended on him, she couldn't accept that reality. "I wouldn't want to stay here if I knew you were my doctor." Her words burned like acid, and Erickson felt the hatred still eating away at his soul. She kept talking, not stopping, as if she couldn't stop even if she wanted to. "Did you think you could change your fate? That you could become something more than just a black mark in this system? You just don't understand that you will never be my equal." With every sentence she spoke, Erickson felt the tragedy growing. In this hospital, among nurses and colleagues, he was respected, but in front of this woman who considered him worthless, he realized how naked his own hopes for acceptance were. "I won't apologize for saving your life," he said, his voice hard and tinged with pain, "but I hope that one day you'll be able to look at me differently." Linda, her face still red with rage, just grinned as if this was her last shot. "Never." Her voice shook, and she said it with such anger that Erickson realized that she wasn't just refusing to acknowledge him, she was refusing to acknowledge herself. At that moment he saw how deep her hatred had pulled her into a dark pit, and he felt truly sorry for her. She was so blind that she could not see how she had imprisoned herself, how her hatred was her own prison. Linda continued to rant and rave, as if her screams could obscure the reality she was in. She couldn't accept the fact that her life now depended on the man she had despised all her life. It was a betrayal to her, and every reproach she made was like a knife. "You just don't know what you're doing," she screamed again, her voice growing shriller. "Do you think your actions make you better? You're just a black man trying to play white. You can never be equal. I'd rather die than let you be my savior." Erickson felt her words, filled with rage, tearing his inner world apart. He knew he should remain calm, but there was such a depth of hatred in her insults that it was impossible. She continued, tirelessly, as if her hatred gave her strength. "How many more of you are there supposed to be in this hospital?" Her voice became even more aggressive. "You are a burden to society. You are incapable of real feelings. You are just a puppet who tries to please white people, as if that makes you better, but you cannot escape your essence." Erickson felt the anger building inside him. She wasn't just putting him down, she was questioning his work, his calling, his humanity. Each rebuke was becoming more painful, as if she were trying to rip his soul out. "You're just playing doctor. You don't know what it means to be a real doctor. You think saving a life is everything, but you can't understand what it means to be a person who respects himself and others. You have no right to even think that you can understand what it means to be white." Her words seemed to squeeze his heart in an iron grip. Each of her attacks was not just an insult. It was something more. It was an attempt to rise at the expense of humiliating another. Erickson felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, and he knew that he could not fall, although she tried to push him. You have no right to tell me about life and death. She screamed again, her voice sounding as if she was trying to rip his dignity out of his chest. You're just a black cut who was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. You can never be the one who could change the world. Erickson gritted his teeth as he felt her words seep into his consciousness. He wasn't just a black doctor trying to put on a show. He was a man who had spent his life fighting prejudice, who had spent years studying and working to save others, but all of that was worthless now in the face of her hatred. How dare you even judge my work? His voice cracked with tension. He stepped closer to her despite her anger. I've worked for this my whole life, and I'm not going to let you, or anyone else, humiliate me for what I do. You just have to accept that you'll always be black. Linda shouted again, as if her words held all her power. You'll never be able to be a part of our culture, our lives. You'll just always look like an admixture that wasn't meant to be. The words hit Erickson like a hammer, and he felt anger building inside him. She wasn't just talking about him. She was rejecting everything he represented. Every cry she made reminded him that to her he was just black, not a person, but the embodiment of everything she hated. You don't understand what it means to be human, Erickson said quietly, his voice full of pain. You don't understand that there is no place for hate in this world. You put your hate above your life, and that is the most tragic thing about this situation. Linda just smirked, and it was a smirk full of contempt. You're just a pathetic black man who hopes for something more, she continued, her voice shaking with hatred. You'll never be able to change people's opinions of you. You'll always be who you are, and no one will ever accept you. Not for anything. You're just a mistake. Every word she said cut like a sharp knife, and Erickson felt a battle begin inside him. He wanted to turn and walk away, to leave her hatred behind, but he knew he couldn't. His life was about saving others, and even in this moment of humiliation, he knew his humanity was more important. I'm not asking for your recognition, he said, trying to contain his emotions. I'm just doing my job, but you have to understand that hatred will not make you stronger. It will only destroy you from the inside. Linda just smirked, her hatred still burning like fire. She had tried to humiliate him, trying to elevate herself at his expense, and this was her last attempt to retain some power in a situation that was slipping away from her. You just don't understand how this works, she said with disdain, her voice sounding like a threat. You think you can save everyone, but you can't. In fact, you're just wasting their time. I'd rather die than rely on someone like you. Erickson closed his eyes again, feeling her words tear him apart from the inside. But inside him, a desire to fight flared up, a desire to prove to her that he was worthy of respect, that he was a man who saved lives despite the hatred. I'm not going to give up on my calling, he said, looking her straight in the eyes. And even if you never accept me, I'll still save people because that's what I have to do. You can't change that, no matter how hard you try. Linda laughed again, her laughter full of madness. You don't understand, she screamed. I will never accept you, and you can't make me do it. I will never be your victim. You just can't. She continued to build tension, as if her words were the last bastion she could use to defend her hatred. Erickson knew this was a battle not just for her life, but for her to see him as a person, not the symbol he represented to her. But it was harder than he thought, and Linda's hatred was becoming his greatest enemy. Linda continued to spew hatred, her voice growing more and more furious, as if she were feeding on her aggression. Every word she spoke was an indictment not only of Erickson, but of his very existence. He felt her contempt tearing at him from the inside, like 1,000 sharp needles. You think you can change my opinion of you? She screamed, her face contorted with anger. You're nothing but a joke. I'll never be able to accept you as a doctor. You're nothing more than a black spot on a white canvas. Every word she said was a blow to his pride, and he knew that perhaps that was exactly what she wanted. Linda saw him not as a person, but as an object to be humiliated, the embodiment of all her fears and hatreds. She could not accept the fact that her life, her future, depended on him. Erickson felt his throat tighten with shame and fear. He was the only black doctor in this hospital, and now, in Linda's eyes, he represented everything she hated. He tried to be strong, but her screams were making him feel not only angry, but also deeply humiliated. You just don't understand that you don't really matter, she continued, sounding as if she was enjoying the humiliation. You're just a foreign body in this world. You don't deserve this life. You don't deserve respect. Erickson closed his eyes again to try and focus. He knew he shouldn't let her hatred take over, but her words were like sharp blades piercing his soul, giving him no peace. He knew he should stay in this moment, but she did everything she could to make him feel worthless. "You may think you're on top, but I can see right through your mask," she continued, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're just a regular black guy trying to pass himself off as something more." Every word she said made the atmosphere tense, and Erickson felt his own vulnerability become even more obvious. He never thought he would encounter such hatred when he was trying to save a life. It was as if he was trapped in a dark cage, and Linda, standing in his way, filled him with more and more fear with each passing moment. "You'd rather die than let me save you, right?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You won't save me anyway," she cried. "You're just waiting for me to die so you can report on your great work. I'd rather you just go away and leave me alone than drag me into this dark world where I have to depend on you." Erickson felt his confidence begin to crumble. She was right, her hatred was immense, and it created a wall around him that he could not overcome. Every time he tried to take a step toward understanding her, she threw words at him like hostile arrows, and he realized that in her eyes he was nothing. "I don't want to depend on you," she continued, her voice ringing with rage. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't even think you can save me. I don't want you touching me." Erickson, feeling his confidence fading, tried to find the strength to confront her. He knew his work was important, but at that moment he felt like the most worthless person in the world. He couldn't let her see him weak, but her hatred was becoming more stifling and overwhelming. "I'm not going to run from this," he said, trying to keep his voice confident. "I save lives, and even if you hate me, I'll do whatever it takes to save yours." Linda just smirked, her face contorted with disdain. "You don't understand," she screamed, her eyes full of hatred. "I will never accept your help. I'd rather die than let you save me. You're not worth having me depend on." Erickson felt his anger slowly turning to fear. He had never experienced such a level of hatred, and it left him powerless. He knew she could leave him humiliated, but he was still willing to fight for her. "If you don't want me to save you," he said, his voice cold, "I won't insist, but know that hatred won't save you. It will only destroy you from the inside, and I can't stop that." Linda grinned again, but there was no joy in her grin. It was only a confirmation of her deep-seated hatred. "You can't change anything," she said with disdain. "You're just another mistake in this world, and I'm not going to let you ruin my life with your presence." Every word she said struck Erickson in the heart. He knew she was desperate, but her hatred, her contempt, was so strong that it filled the entire room like dark clouds. Erickson realized that even at this moment, when her life depended on him, she was choosing hatred. "I'm not going to leave you," he said, trying to regain his confidence. "I'll be here because it's my job, and even if you hate me, I'll still do everything I can to save you." Linda rolled her eyes again, her gaze filled with nothing but contempt. "You don't understand anything," she said, her voice sounding like a piercing scream. "You can't change anything. You'll never be able to make me accept your help, and that's a fact." At that moment, Erickson felt his entire existence begin to crumble. Linda's hatred was like shackles strangling him. He knew that this was a battle not only for her life, but for his own dignity. Every scream she made reminded him how thin the line between life and death was, and how easy it was to lose everything. "You will never understand what it is to be a doctor," he said, feeling his heart break with humiliation. "I cannot let you destroy yourself because of hatred." But Linda just smirked, her voice sounding like an evil laugh. "You can't break me," she said with contempt. "You're just a black man trying to pass himself off as a doctor. I won't let you force your hatred on me." Erickson felt his soul begin to fade under her onslaught. Every reproach she made left scars on him, and he realized that his fight was not only with her, but with himself. In that moment, he realized that hatred knew no bounds, and he might never be able to understand what it was like to be in her shoes. He knew he had to stay strong, but her hatred, her aggression, was becoming more and more overwhelming. Every scream she made was a personal humiliation for him, and deep down he knew that her hatred could drown out everything he had ever considered important. Erickson stood before her as if on a battlefield, preparing for another attack. He felt the tension growing in the air, and each of her phrases pierced him like a needle, making his heart beat faster. Linda did not stop trying to humiliate him, and hatred burned in her eyes, like a fire, igniting the atmosphere around her. "You think you can save me?" she screamed again, her voice sounding like she was about to rip his soul out. "You're just playing a role, and you'll never be a real doctor. You're nothing more than a bug in a system that will never accept someone like you." Erickson felt her words piercing him, tearing at his inner world. She spoke as if his work didn't matter, as if all his efforts were futile and he had no right to be here. Every cry she made was a reminder that in some people's eyes he was just black, nothing more than a label that had nothing to do with his qualifications or knowledge. "I'm not playing a role," he said, trying to remain calm. "I'm a doctor, and I'm here to help. No matter what you think of me, I'll do everything I can to save you." "Help?" she sneered, and there was only contempt in her voice. "Do you really think that your help means anything? You can't change anything in your life, much less in mine. I'd rather die than let you touch me." Every word she said was like a thorn piercing his soul. Erickson felt a sense of powerlessness growing inside him. He had always considered himself resilient, capable of dealing with any situation, but Linda's hatred was eroding all his strength. She was becoming more and more aggressive with each passing moment, and he did not know how to interact with her any longer. "You don't understand what real life is," she screamed, her voice growing shrill. "You'll never be a part of this world. You don't deserve respect or recognition. You're in the wrong place." Erickson, feeling her words burn him, tried to find confidence within himself. He knew he was fighting not only her hatred, but his own fears. He couldn't let her drown his hopes. Each of her reproaches, each humiliation became more and more difficult, and he realized that this was not just a conflict, it was a fight for his own dignity. "I'm not looking for recognition," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm here because it's important to me that you stay alive. You have to understand that hatred only destroys, and it will not lead to anything good." Linda just smirked, her eyes glittering with disdain. "You can't teach me how to live. You don't know what it means to be human. You'll never be able to understand what it means to be proud of your origin. You're just a disgrace to your people." Every word she spoke burned like a hot iron. Erickson knew that her hatred was not simply directed at him, but reflected deeper fears and prejudices she carried within herself. He had become a target, a victim of her inner demons, and it was terrifying. "You just don't understand what it means to be a doctor," she continued, her voice sounding as if she wanted to tear him apart. "You don't know what real responsibility is. You have no right to even think that you can save someone." Erickson felt his heart pounding in his chest, his breathing heavy. He stood before her as if he were on trial, and every word she said was a sentence. She was trying to make him feel worthless, and she was succeeding. Each moment of humiliation felt like an eternity, and he knew this was not just a fight for her life, but to reclaim his own identity. "I'm not doing this for you," he said, feeling his anger begin to flare. "I'm doing this for everyone who faces this kind of hatred. I want to show that this hatred has no power unless we let it get the better of us." Linda just smirked, her contempt seemingly endless. "You can't break me," she screamed. "I'll never be your patient. I'll never accept your help. You're nothing more than a burden, and that's a fact." Erickson felt his inner world begin to waver. He knew he shouldn't give in, but her hatred was so powerful that it overshadowed everything. Every reproach, every humiliation left scars on him, and he knew that this could become his greatest enemy. "I'll be here even if you hate me," he said, trying to be strong. "I won't back down until I've done everything I can to save you." "You think you can save me?" she screamed, her voice a threat. "You don't need me. I'll never be a part of your world. You'll never be able to change me." Erickson knew that her hatred was deeper than he had imagined. It reflected every prejudice she carried within herself, and he was its target. Every cry she made was a test for him, and he knew he couldn't afford to give in. "Hate only kills," he said, his voice filled with determination. "You must understand that life is not meant to be lived in contempt. I am here to help, even if you do not understand it." Linda smirked again, her contempt unbearable. "You can't change my mind," she said. "I'd rather die than let you touch me." Erickson felt his soul begin to fade under her onslaught. He never thought he would face this level of hatred, and it left him exhausted. He knew he had to stay strong, but her hatred, her aggression, was becoming more and more overwhelming. Every scream she made was a personal humiliation for him, and deep down he knew that her hatred could drown out everything he had ever considered important. Erickson was on edge, his nerves on edge. Linda continued to spew hate, and every attack burned him like acid rain. She was like a cornered animal, and her aggression only intensified the fear that was beginning to take hold of him. "You think you're better than the others?" she screamed, her voice sounding like a dying scream. "You're just a black doctor trying to pretend to be someone important. You don't deserve this place, and I'll never acknowledge you." Erickson felt her words pierce him like spears, and he knew this was a battle not just for her life, but for his own dignity. He tried to stay afloat, but her hatred filled the room like dark clouds, threatening his very existence. "I'm here because my job is important," he said, his voice more confident, but inside him a hurricane was raging. "I can't let you destroy yourself, even if you want to." Linda just smirked, and there was nothing but contempt in her smirk. "You don't understand what real life is," she continued, her words flying at him like sharp knives. "You don't know what it means to fight for your rights. You will never be a part of this world, and I will not let you take my life from me." Every word she said was like a blow, and Erickson felt his own strength fading. Her hatred was not just directed at him, it was a reflection of all her fears, and he had become her target. He saw her every breath was saturated with hatred, and he knew that this was a battle not just for her life, but for his own existence. "You can never change me," she screamed, her voice ringing in the room like thunder. "I'd rather die than let you do anything to me." Erickson felt his anger begin to boil. He knew she was desperate, but that desperation was clothed in hatred, and she left him no choice. Each insult she uttered was a reminder of how easy it was to be vulnerable when faced with aggression. "I don't want to change you," he said, his voice turning cold. "I want you to understand that life is more important than hate. You have to give yourself a chance, even if it seems like everything is lost. You have no right to tell me anything," she screamed, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You're nothing but a nobody trying to pass yourself off as a doctor. I won't let you force your ideas about life on me." Erickson felt her words becoming more aggressive. He knew that her hatred was not just an emotional expression, it was her defense, her way of coping with her own fears. But now it was too much. "I'm not going to give up," he said, feeling determination building inside him. "I'll be here even if you hate me. I won't back down until I've done everything I can to save you." Linda just laughed, and the laugh was full of contempt. "You think your help matters?" she said sarcastically. "You're just a black man trying to hide his insignificance behind a medical uniform. I don't need you, and I'll never need you." Every word she said oppressed him, and he realized that her hatred had become his evil. She did not simply reject him, she created in him a fear that was insurmountable. Erickson realized that his pride, his desire to help, were being shattered against a wall of hatred and contempt. "You can't make me go away," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll be here until you learn that hatred can't save you." Linda, unwilling to accept his presence, rolled her eyes as if he was the last obstacle in her way. "You must understand that you are nothing but a black spot in this world," she shouted, her voice full of malice. "I will not allow you to humiliate me by helping me. I would rather die than allow you to achieve your vile success." Erickson felt her hatred burning through him, and he knew this was not just a conflict, but a fight for survival. He stood on the edge of an abyss, and each of her screams became more and more overwhelming. "I won't leave you in trouble," he said, trying to remain confident. "I'm here to save your life, even if you don't realize it. You're just a cheap game to me," she screamed, her voice full of contempt. "You're worthless. I'm not going to accept help from someone like you." Every word she said was like a blow, and Erickson knew that Linda's hatred was not waning. She had become his curse, his unpredictable enemy. He knew he had to stay strong, but there was no end to her hatred. "You must understand that life is more important than hate," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I am here to save you, even if you don't want to." Linda just smirked, her contempt permeating the atmosphere. "You don't understand what it's like to be at rock bottom," she said with hatred. "You'll never be able to understand what it's like to be crushed and humiliated. You'll never be human." Erickson, overcome with despair, felt his own inner fears begin to surface. He was fighting not only for her life, but also for his own identity not to be trampled. Every reproach, every humiliation left scars on him, and he knew this fight would last a long time. "I'm not going to give up," he said, his voice becoming more determined. "I'm here because I believe in my work and in people. You have to give yourself a chance, even if it seems like all is lost." Linda laughed again, and her laugh was full of contempt. "You can't change my mind," she said. "I'd rather die than let you touch me." Erickson knew that every word she said touched his deepest fears. He had always believed that he could handle any situation, but Linda's hatred was eroding his strength. He could not allow her to see him weak, but her hatred was becoming more stifling and overwhelming. "Hate only kills," he said, his voice filled with determination. "You must understand that life is not meant to be lived in contempt. I am here to help, even if you do not understand it." Linda smirked again, her gaze full of malice. "You will never understand what it means to be a normal person," she said, her voice sounding like a threat. "You will never be able to force me to accept your help. I will not allow you to force your hatred on me." Erickson felt his own pride begin to fade. Deep down, he knew that this hatred, this aggression that was coming from Linda, could destroy everything he had ever known about himself. "I'll be here even if you hate me," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I won't back down until I've done everything I can to save you." And at that moment he understood, this fight was not just for Linda's life, but also so that he could endure all of this himself. Linda gritted her teeth and stared at Erickson with a hatred that filled her like poison. Every time her gaze met his, memories of what had formed her prejudice flared up inside her. Since she was a child, she had grown up in a small town where racism was not just the norm, but the foundation of their worldview. Her family had instilled in her ideals that seemed unshakable. She had heard her father, red-faced and nursing a stiff drink, talk about the other people, how they were supposedly threatening the real Americans. The words sounded like incantations, and each time they were spoken, they absorbed more hatred and fear. "You know what they're like," he repeated, pointing at the people with different skin colors, as if they were some kind of curse. "They're just waiting for the moment to destroy everything." Linda absorbed these words like a sponge, and as she grew older, they became her inner truth. On the streets where she played, people with different skin were always the objects of jokes and scorn. Her mother proudly showed her how to hide her toys when she was around unworthy neighbors. Linda couldn't understand why this was the norm, but she didn't dare ask questions. Everyone around her supported this point of view, and it seemed the only possible choice. In her eyes, Erickson became the personification of all the fears that had been instilled in her since childhood. She could not and did not want to see him as a person. She saw only the color of his skin, which became a symbol of threat to her. Every time he tried to save her, she felt panic growing inside her. "You're part of this problem," she screamed, clenching her fists. "You think you can help me, but you're only confirming all my fears. You can't save me because you're part of the dark cloud that hangs over this world." Erickson, tormented, tried to understand where this hatred was coming from. He knew that there was something more behind her words, deep, ingrained fears that came from her childhood. He felt sorry for her, but at the same time he understood that she was ready to fight not only him, but also the world that surrounded her. "You don't understand," he said, trying to remain calm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I want to help. It doesn't depend on the color of your skin. We're all human, and we all need help." Linda laughed, but it wasn't a joyful laugh. It was pure contempt. "You talk about humanity, but to me you're nothing more than a statistic," she screamed. "You're just confirming all the preconceived ideas I've been taught since I was a child. I won't accept any help from you." She kept remembering how her parents had taken her to local meetings where they talked about how blacks were taking over jobs, how they were threatening white people's safety. These ideas had become ingrained in her mind, and now, at a critical moment in her life, they were being thrown at Erickson, who she felt represented everything she feared. Every word she said cut through Erickson like a sharp knife. He knew that her hatred was only a reflection of her inner fear and insecurity. Every reproach, every insult was a reflection of her own demons, but at that moment, he couldn't back down. "I understand where your hatred comes from," he said with complete determination, "but I'm not going to give up. I'm here to do everything I can to save your life." Linda, feeling threatened, just laughed. "You think you can save me just because you wear a white coat?" she said, her voice filled with contempt. "You're just confirmation of my fears, and I'll never believe that you can do anything good for me." Erickson understood that her hatred came not only from her, but from her entire environment, from the system she had grown up in. He saw how fear and hatred were passed down from generation to generation, and this realization was especially difficult for him. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice urgent. "I'm here to help. You have to understand that this doesn't depend on the color of your skin. We all have to fight the hatred that's eating away at our society." But every word he said only fueled her rage. Linda couldn't accept that someone she considered like him could take responsibility for her life. In her eyes, Erickson was just part of the problem that had plagued her throughout her life. "I will not be part of your experiment," she screamed, her voice filled with hatred. "You are nothing but a disgrace to your people, and I will not allow you to take away my right to my own life." Erickson felt her words tearing him apart. He knew her hatred was laced with fear, but that didn't make him feel any better. Every humiliation she put him down was too much for him to handle. "You have to give yourself a chance," he said, trying to remain confident. "You have to understand that hatred will not lead to anything good. I am here to save you, and I can't leave until you understand that." Linda just smirked, her contempt complete. She wasn't going to let him interfere with her life, and the hatred continued to tear her apart from the inside. "I would rather die than let you touch me," she said with disdain. Erickson knew that this hatred was more than just personal animosity. It was a reflection of the fear and prejudice she carried within her for years. He knew that her hatred was not just for him, but for everything he represented. The struggle was becoming more and more complicated, and every cry she made felt like a challenge that could not go unanswered. Erickson stood before Linda. Her hatred seemed bottomless, and with every word that came out of her mouth, he felt the tension build. He knew that time was against them. Every second could be critical to her life, and her rage seemed to be the only source of energy she could draw on. "You can't ignore the truth," he said, his voice calm but his soul raging. "If you don't give yourself a chance, you risk losing everything. Time is running out, and this isn't a game." Linda ignored him, her eyes glowing like coals in a fire. She continued cursing him, as if words could dispel her fears. Erickson knew that her condition was critical, her heart could not cope with the load, and he knew that every emotion, every outburst of hatred, only worsened her health. "If you don't relax, if you don't let go of this anger, you may not live to see the morning," he said, his voice growing more insistent. "I'm not just a doctor, I'm trying to save your life." But Linda only chuckled, and that laughter was full of poison. "I don't care," she screamed, her voice filled with mad determination. "I'd rather die than let you touch me. You're not my savior, you're my enemy." Erickson felt the desperation building inside him. He knew that her hatred was more than just an emotional manifestation, it was her weapon, her armor, but that armor was also killing her from the inside, and he had to act fast. "Linda, you don't understand what's happening right now," he said, trying to remain calm. "If you continue to behave like this, you'll die. I can't let that happen." At that moment, her heart began to pound, as if it was trying to escape from her chest. Erickson noticed her face turn pale and her breathing become shallow. He knew that her condition was worsening, and that her hatred was not just sapping her strength, it was threatening her life. "You can't scare me," she said, her voice shaking but still angry. "I won't give up." Erickson knew that if she didn't calm down, her heart might break. He began to realize that her prejudice and hatred were not only consuming her, but were tearing him apart from the inside. He felt his own strength draining away. "I'm not the enemy," he said, trying not to lose his composure. "You have to understand that I'm here to help. This isn't just about you. This is about life and death." Linda chuckled again, but now there was fear in her voice. She was beginning to realize that her own hatred could cost her her life. With each passing second, her eyes grew more restless, and her breathing became more ragged. "You can't make me acknowledge you," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but still threatening. Erickson felt anxiety begin to take hold of him. He knew that every moment mattered. "You mustn't do this," he shouted. "If you don't calm down, I can't help. You're risking everything you have." At that moment, her heart began to beat even faster, and Erickson saw her begin to convulse. Her body seemed to be contracting in agony. He stepped closer, trying to assess the situation. "Linda," he said, his voice warning, "you have to relax. I'm not your enemy. I'm here to save you." But there was no longer anger in her eyes, only fear. Hatred had become her last refuge, and now that she was faced with the possibility of death, that refuge had collapsed. I can't breathe," she gasped, her voice growing even quieter. Erickson knew time was running out. He knew he had to act fast. He hurried toward the equipment that could help her, but at the same time he was filled with dread. What would happen if she didn't accept his help? If her hatred consumed her? "I'm ready to do whatever it takes," he shouted, trying to get her attention. "I won't let you get away." Linda looked at him in panic, and Erickson noticed how her face changed. There was no longer anger there, only horror, and the change was unexpected. "You have to give yourself a chance," he said, trying to reach her mind. "If you don't stop, you could lose everything." Her condition was getting worse with each passing moment. Erickson quickly hooked her up to the machine, and he knew that if he couldn't get her condition back to normal, she might not live to see the next day. "You have to fight," he said, trying to hold her hands. "I'm here, and I won't leave you." But at that moment Linda could no longer answer. She only looked at him, her eyes full of fear and awareness. I don't want to die," she whispered, and it was the first admission of her vulnerability. Erickson felt a heavy burden settle on his heart. He knew that their fight for life was just beginning, and he had to do everything he could to help her, even if she didn't want it. "You have to let me help," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not going to leave until you understand that life is more important than hate." Linda, in confronting her own fears, finally began to realize that the hatred and prejudice that had been her protection had become her jailers. Erickson, seeing her begin to give in, knew it would be a long road, but he was willing to fight for her life, and for her opportunity to see the world differently, without prejudice and hatred. A new feeling flared up inside him, not anger or hatred, but a desire to save her, to show her that even in the darkest places there was light. He was ready to fight, even if her own mind tried to stop him. Erickson, determined, continued to work, ignoring the confusion and hatred that Linda was radiating. His hands moved quickly and confidently, and he hooked her up to a machine that began monitoring her heart rate. He had to do everything he could to stabilize her, even if she still genuinely considered him an enemy. Every second seemed like an eternity. He watched the monitor closely, his heart pounding in unison with her fading. He knew time was not on their side. Soothing words were no longer useful. It was a fight for survival now. Erickson used all his skills, all his experience, to bring her to a state of stability. "Linda, listen to me," he said with complete concentration. "I'm going to do what it takes to keep you alive. Hang in there." As time went on, her condition began to change. Her vital signs began to return to normal. Though Erickson couldn't take his eyes off her, he watched as her face gradually lost its expression of hatred and rage. Instead, he saw fear mixed with confusion as she realized that her life depended on him. With each passing second, as Linda's heart began to beat more steadily, Erickson felt his own strength being restored. He could not believe that this woman who hated him so much could change her attitude simply by realizing that he was the one fighting for her life. He realized that her hatred was just a mask covering her fear of the unknown. Finally, after many minutes of intense work, Erickson felt her heart begin to beat more steadily. He checked the readings on the monitor. They had become stable. This was the first evidence that his efforts had not been in vain. "You're doing it, Linda," he said, not believing that all this was happening. "You're doing it." He continued to watch her until her breathing became even and the color began to return to her face. Erickson couldn't help but smile as she watched her lips part slightly and she tried to speak. It was a weak, almost inaudible word, but he sensed hope in the sound. You can't be." Her voice sounded with difficulty, but there was no longer any hatred in it. Erickson leaned closer, his heart beating faster. This was more than just saving a life, it was the beginning of a new understanding. "I'm here to help," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "You're safe. I won't let you get away." He continued to watch her, and her eyes began to fill with tears. They weren't tears of pain, but rather a reaction to the realization of her vulnerability and fear. She slowly began to understand that life and death were not determined by the color of one's skin, but only by one's inner state, by how one chose to look at the world. But even as Linda began to realize that Erickson truly wanted to help her, he couldn't completely shake off the shadow of their conflict. He was haunted by the thought of how easily fear and hatred could tear apart relationships. Even though he had saved her life, the experience had left an indelible mark on him. Every time he looked at her face, he remembered how she hated him simply for who he was. It was hard to live with. Erickson knew he had done what he had to do to save her, but her words, filled with rage and contempt, still echoed in his head. He knew her struggle was not only physical, but spiritual as well. The therapists often talked about the importance of separating the personal from the professional, but it was harder than it seemed. Erickson couldn't shake the fact that this woman was ultimately a product of a system that had built walls of hatred and fear around her. he still felt the impact of the situation on his heart. A few days later, when Linda had recovered and was able to sit up in bed, she looked at Erickson with new eyes. It was a realization, an understanding, and in that look he saw a glimpse of what had once been blocked by hatred. "You saved me," she said quietly, and the confession sounded like a revelation. Erickson nodded, unsure of what to say. He knew her words weren't just about physical salvation, they were an admission that hatred and fear couldn't defeat humanity. "I never thought it was possible," she continued, her voice full of confusion. "I always thought you were the enemy, but now—" He saw her hesitate, as if trying to find words to describe her feelings. "I realize now that I cannot let hatred rule me," she said, her voice full of determination. "I was blind." Erickson felt his heart fill with hope. It might be the first spark of understanding that could change not only her life, but his own ideas about what it meant to be a doctor. "It's a long way," he said, his voice full of warmth, "but I believe you can get through it." Linda nodded, and in her eyes Erickson saw a reflection of a future where hatred could be conquered. Even though the shadow of their conflict still lingered in his mind, he knew he had done what had to be done, and he hoped that Linda, too, would find a way to free herself from the chains that had once bound her. Erickson realized that Linda's situation was more than just a conflict between two people. It was a clash of two worldviews that could be the beginning of a new life free of hatred. He hoped that their encounter would be a lesson for both of them, a lesson about the importance of remaining open to change, even when the world around them seemed contradictory. In fact, this was the end of their story, the beginning of something new. Linda and Erickson, each of whom had their own prejudices and fears, found the strength to reconsider their views. Despite all the difficulties, they took a step towards understanding and acceptance. Linda was finally freed from the shackles of hatred and began to see the world in a new light. Erickson, in turn, realized how important empathy and humanity are in his profession. While Linda was rebuilding her life, Erickson continued to do his job, but with a new sense of purpose. He knew that their meeting was no accident, it was a lesson he would carry with him. They both had a long road ahead, full of changes and difficulties, but as they learned in this ordeal, even the darkest moments can lead to brighter discoveries, and that was the essence of their story, a journey from hatred to understanding, from fear to hope. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know in the comments what you think. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How did you deal with such situations? You are very important to us, and we appreciate each of you. Your votes help us grow and develop. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Have a nice day and look forward to seeing your comments.